In this episode, we're talking all about using technology in the language classroom. This is the first of 2 episodes on this topic since there are so many useful resources to talk about. I'm joined by Joe Dale, a highly influential and sought-after voice when it comes to all things about technology and language learning. There are sure to be lots of suggestions that you want to look into. Everything Joe Dale mentions is linked in the show notes. You can also get all the links in the blog post that's associated with this episode. Just go to wlclassroom.com/EP34 for episode 34. So wlclassroom.com/EP34. So much to discuss. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral. Thank you for being the wonderful teacher that you are, that you take time out of your week, each week, to listen to what is happening in language teaching, what other teachers are doing, to be inspired and to confirm what you're doing. So thank you on behalf of your colleagues and your students for doing that. Make sure that you are following this podcast wherever you're listening right now. That might mean subscribing or following. Just make sure you're doing that so that we can hang out together. We're going to be talking about technology. And not just, let's use technology in the classroom because there are some fun games you can do, but really, how are we leveraging technology to enhance the learning experience? So I'm joined today by Joe Dale, who is in the UK. So he is my first international guest on the podcast, which is so exciting for me. He's coming in all the way from across the pond. As we say, I'm in Boston, he's in the UK. So we really just have the Atlantic Ocean between us. And he is in the Isle of Wight in the UK, and he can tell us a little more about what that actually means and their claim to fame a little bit. But he is a former French teacher. He did that for about 13 years. But I would probably say he wouldn't say he's a former French teacher because he continues to be a teacher. But for the last 11 years, he's really focused on using technology to enhance the language learning experience. And in particular, if you know me and you've listened to this podcast, I like the research. And he says that what he does is this evidence-based approach to teaching. And what better thing to talk about on the World Language Classroom Podcast than evidence-based approaches to teaching? So thank you so very much for being with us today, Joe Dale. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you ever so much, Joshua, for this opportunity. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd love, first of all, to talk about the Isle of Wight, of course.
Yeah, sure.
I've been on the Isle of Wight for over 20 years now. For those people that don't know where the Isle of Wight is, it's about 25 minutes away via ferry from Southampton, which is where the Titanic left back in 1914, was it, I think, if I remember correctly. And also the song by the Beatles, When I'm 64, refers to the Isle of Wight as well, and also in the book, The Day of the Triffids, they end up on the Isle of Wight. That's where they survive at the end. So there we are, claim to fame, being on the Isle of Wight.
That is excellent. So if anyone's on Twitter who's listening, you've likely seen some of what Joe is showing us on Twitter and everything. And one of the things he has is a hashtag, which is the MFL Twitterati hashtag. So if you're using that hashtag on there, you can see that he is the mastermind behind creating that to bring that to everyone. So can you talk to us a little bit, Joe, about your transition and why did you decide to really focus on technology in terms of the work that you do with teachers and professional development?
As in my life in general, I tend to, once I get into something, I get really, really into it. And I find that I can then, help other people with different passions that I have. Technology is one which I've been interested in for quite a few years now. You may be surprised to hear I wasn't, like a geeky child when I grew up. I used to swap, like ZX Spectrum games and things like that. I'm showing my age now, but I was never really, that good with technology. It was around 2000 when I sort of learned really how to properly, word process and all the rest of it. Wasn't very good with technology at all prior to that, and it just so happened that I found I got really good at it. I got really passionate about it, and as a result of that, I was able to via the internet train myself up, and then I started speaking at conferences, and it just sort of went from there. Really, I got into blogging and podcasting. People were saying at various conference talks right from the word go that they seemed to find the tips that I was sharing useful. They were very practical, and I would know about lots of different tools that I would recommend, and I would present in a very sort of like step by step guides and things like that, and then doing face to face training. It was just something that seemed to be something that I was good at. So as a result of that, I decided back in 2009 to sort of try, a second career, as it were, on doing this sort of thing full time, because I was sort of running myself ragged trying to be a full-time teacher, head of department for the last 3 years, going away most weekends, running training or speaking at conferences. I decided to go for it full-time and see, how that would be. And I've never looked back, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then particularly during the pandemic, because of, my skill set, I've been, again, bending over backwards to try and help people via Twitter, via the MFL Twitter RT hashtag, via a myriad of different webinars for language departments, language organizations, districts, literally all over the world. I feel very lucky that I've had the opportunity of being able to do that, as opposed to, say, being in another profession like, I don't know, a musician, where life would be a lot harder to try and make a living during the pandemic. So fortunately, I have been able to pivot, as one says, and still being able to, make a living through my knowledge and being able to help people at the same time.
So, in doing the math a little bit, where you were teaching for 13 years, you've been doing the PD work for 10 or 11 years, it looks like the teaching for you started about 23, 24 years ago. So, I'm curious if you go back to the beginning of your teaching experience. Now, we're looking probably at the late 90s at that point, right?
Mid 90s.
Mid
I
90s, right?
trained. I trained up as a teacher in the mid 90s, having had 2 years in Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
because before we started recording, yeah, you told me all about coming from Quebec, which is really interesting. So I
Uh-huh.
had 2 years in Quebec as a language assistant. I then came back to the UK. I did my TEFL certificate in Canterbury in Kent, and then I did my PGCE in North Wales, and then I taught for 3 years at secondary level, and then
Mhm.
had my 10 years at middle school level with 9 13-year-olds.
Yeah. So at the beginning of that, going back, 20 plus years, technology was not a very present thing in our classrooms. I mean, it was, it just didn't look, it wasn't as advanced as it is now. So can you just, not to spend too much time on it, but when you started to bring technology into your own classroom and seeing the benefits of it, even early on, can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So around 2002, I think it was, I came across the website, which at the time was called bonjour.org.uk, which is now Linguiscope, and I was really inspired by the way that you could have these, interactive exercises, and they were self-marked, and you got immediate feedback, and then off the back of that, I explored how to make these sorts of exercises using Hot Potatoes, which is a Canadian multimedia exercise suite, which is still available for free, I think, to download. And then, yeah, I got into PowerPoint, and then blogging and podcasting, and just went from there, really. But
Mhm.
I think, I mean, I've said this on other podcasts, but I think it's great in a way that we have the technology that we have now with the pandemic, compared to if we'd had the pandemic, say, 20 years ago. I think it would have been a very different picture,
Absolutely.
with the internet speeds, the video quality, or the lack of video, streaming capability, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. So I think we've come a long way. But
Hmm.
that said, I think the pedagogy has remained the same, really. We want to give feedback. We want the students to collaborate. We want them to be creative. We want them to produce good presentations. We want them to collaborate with other classes to practice their language. So I think those sorts of pillars have not changed, but what has changed is the technology has become better, quicker, easier to use, etc.
So let's unpack that piece a little bit. We're holding fast to feedback and the pedagogy, but now we are able to enhance that through technology. So how has technology enhanced those very basic underpinnings of our teaching of feedback and pedagogy?
For example, in relation to feedback, it's now very easy, for example, to give comments on Google Docs in a class notebook in a Microsoft environment. We can now easily give audio feedback as a multimodal approach, so that the students can hear the power of their teacher's voice, which is more personal and maybe intimate to them. They can then take on board the feedback that they're given. So I think that sort of ability to give other forms of feedback rather than always written feedback is a great time saver. And I also think that from the point of view of one of the powers I think of technology is the way in which you can get immediate feedback. So tools such as Quizlet and Duolingo and all those other sorts of quizzing tools around the idea of low stakes testing and retrieval practice are really good in the way that they do give immediate feedback to the students. The way that the algorithms are set up, they're constantly being reminded of the words they need to work on and the strategies that they need to put in place to help them to retain the language. So I think those sorts of ideas and how the technology is facilitating the pedagogy is absolutely wonderful. So particularly recently, to quote an example, I think the Moat Chrome extension has proved very popular amongst not just language teachers but teachers from around the world, because the idea of audio feedback has been there for a long, long time. There's been various research behind that and the power of it, and the fact that generally students say they find it more personal and they like the feedback that they receive from the teacher. It's something a bit different, but the fact that Moat allows you to leave audio comments within Google Classroom, Google Slides, Google Docs, the way that you can have audio within a Google form, so that you can have a listening comprehension activity with the audio in the question as well as the 4 answers. You can have audio for those, the way that you can send audio via Gmail, the way you can have audio within Jamboard using Moat. I think there's lots and lots of different possibilities, and that's what technology should do at its best. It should be simple and easy to use, but provide new opportunities, and that in a way is the way in which it enhances traditional ideas such as the importance of feedback.
I think a lot of teachers think of technology as the game websites, like the how to do the games with the iPads, and those tend to be the ones that students ask for because they enjoy them and they can get a little overused, but I appreciate your framing it as using technology to enhance the good teaching and not do sort of the games as the one-offs. So I would like to sort of expand a little bit on this idea of feedback and pedagogy, and really look at the different language skills. So we're looking at the interpersonal, we're looking at reading and writing. For those listening in the US, we use the actful modes of communication is the language around that. That's what I'm getting at. So when it comes to interpersonal and reading and writing, um, I would like to have some ideas about how to use technology to address those specific skills. So I don't know if you want to break them down or if there are some that can be used for all of them.
Okay, well, starting off with reading, I think that, again, if we think about how we traditionally test reading or do reading comprehension, we make gap fills. That's a sort of a classic idea. So if you wanted to recreate a gap fill activity, there's a really nice Google Doc add-on called Close It, which is spelled CLOZE, capital letters, and then IT on the end, so Close It. So you just have to go to Google Docs, go to the add-ons option and do a search for Close It, and you'll find it. What it allows you to do is you just put in a text, and then you can then easily select or highlight different words within that text or short chunks, and then turn it into a gap fill activity. Another way of doing the same thing is to highlight an individual word or short chunk, to change the background to the same color as to change the color of the text to the same color as the background, and also to underline it, and then to use the Format Painter tool, which is available in Google Doc and Microsoft Word. Double tap on that or double click on that, and then simply go through all the different words you want to turn into gaps by double clicking on them, and it will then transfer the formatting from that first one to all the other ones. And that's another easy way of making a gap fill.
And that was using Close It, it's
Yeah,
called?
so Close It is
Mhm.
is a Google Doc add-on which was
Okay.
developed by a physics teacher from London. But for language teachers, I think it's just a great way of being able to turn any text into a gap fill by doing what I've suggested. And what it does as well is it takes all those words and then puts them underneath in a chronological list. And of course, you could then delete that if you wanted to give more agency to the students, or you could have it differentiated so you could give some gap fills to the students who maybe were stronger without the words at the bottom, and then
Mhm.
ones who you think might struggle a bit with the words at the bottom. So it's really nice from that point of view. So it's essentially it's just taking a Google Doc and just adapting it slightly in order to turn it into a gap fill. And then you could do the same thing, as I said, with Word using the Format Painter option.
Whenever you're mentioning these add-ons or Chrome extension, are these things that we just as teachers need to have on our accounts to create them and then students can then use them? Or do they also have to have those extensions and add-ons when they're accessing it through their Google Drive?
Okay, great question. So with Close It, it's just the teacher that needs to have it to create the gap fill. In relation to Mote that I was talking about earlier with audio feedback, if the students have the Mote extension, they don't have to, but if they do have it working on their web browser, on say a laptop, a Chromebook, a Mac, etc., then it means that the player will appear for them to click on and listen to the audio. If they don't have it, they just get the link, so they can click on the link and then let's say it's on an iPad, it will they just open up onto a new page and they can listen to the audio. So it's not stopping them from hearing the audio. It's just that you get the nice player if you have the extension installed. So of course you can't have an extension on an iPad.
Mm-hmm.
You would just get the link. But that said, there is an iOS app for Mote, which means you can record your notes on your iPad, and it's all synced with your account on your desktop. So that's really nice as well. There's a new plugin or new feature of Microsoft Teams now, because I know I've talked a little bit about Google. So just to give the Microsoft fans a bit of love out there, I know we've talked quite a lot about Google ideas so far. There's a new feature of Microsoft Teams called Reading Progress. Now, I've seen this demonstrated a couple of times in various webinars, and essentially the idea is the teacher is able to ask the students to record themselves. It turns the audio into text. It then allows them to say what their reading progress is based on the text which appears because of what they've said. I think that's right. As I said, I've only seen it a couple of times, but for those people that have Microsoft, it is really really easy to do. And I would also recommend, if you want to find out more about it, if you go along to my YouTube channel, which is Joe Dale 100, and you look for the show and tell session that we did at Christmas as part of the Tilt webinar series. So Tilt stands for Technology and Language Teaching. And Jane Bassnett, who is a head of department in a school in the south of England and also in charge of e-learning in her school, she works in a Microsoft Showcase school. She demonstrated live how to do reading progress. So I may have misrepresented how it works exactly, but I remember she'd asked the colleague to record her voice. It had the text on the screen, and then the reading progress plugin allows you to then dissect the reading level of that particular person and then give advice on how that person can improve. So if I have got it wrong, do check out Jane's webinar contribution, as well as the other contributions within that series. And just talking about the Tilt webinar series, we've done over 140 webinars in the series since the start of the pandemic with myself and my friend Helen Myers, who's the chair of the London branch of the Association for Language Learning, which is the equivalent of ACFIL in the UK.
Have you found anything that would be like that in the Google world?
Not at the moment. There's nothing available, as far as I'm aware, that matches reading progress. In my opinion, it's the other way around. Normally, it's normally Google come out with something and then Microsoft copies it.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, in the case of Google Classroom, suddenly there was Microsoft Classroom, and then that turned into
Mm-hmm.
Class Notebook and so on and so forth. But or Microsoft Teams, should I say? Actually, but I'm not aware of anything of the same level as reading progress. There's also Flipgrid as well, which I think is really good for reading from the point of view of the obvious way of using it is for speaking listening work, but the fact that you can generate closed captions automatically in a variety of languages with Flipgrid could also really help, I think, with reading or like a listening comprehension practice whereby you give the students the captions beforehand, so you can then do some pre-listening activities, but they're reading the transcript, as I said, which is generated automatically. So I think that's another way in which you could promote reading amongst students for sure.
Okay, we want to look at writing?
Yeah, let's do writing.
Okay, let's talk about writing.
Okay, so writing, something which has proved popular amongst the MFL Twitterati since the pandemic, I would say, is this idea of collaborative writing. In particular, this idea of live writing, whereby you have a table made up of a variety of different columns. In the first column, the students put their names. In the second column, they write their text in their individual cell. And then in the third one, the teacher gives written feedback. So the idea is that they're all doing it live. That's why it's called live writing. And then the teacher would give some feedback on a particular, let's say, word or short phrase that the student has written in their paragraph. They then change it in real time to make it better. So that's a really nice idea, I think, and it's made very easy in either a Microsoft or a Google environment, whereby in a Microsoft environment, you could use a collaborative PowerPoint or a Microsoft Word document or a class notebook. The idea is that you're just adding everybody at the same time in the same document, so they're all working together. And then likewise in the Google environment, you could use a Google Doc, you could use a Google Slides presentation. And it so happened that in the MFL Twitterati, there were people that were getting very excited about this idea of having a collaborative Microsoft PowerPoint presentation whereby you had a template in each of the slides. And the idea is that you'd have one student per template or one student per slide, should I say. So the template stays the same. You just copy it X number of times for the number of students in the class. And then you can see the icon, top right of each of the slides showing that student was on that particular slide. And if you see two icons next to each other, then you know that there are two people that are working on the same slide. And if that's not the idea of the activity, the teacher can then let them know. And likewise in Google Slides, you could have click on the slide sorter view. Also, the slide sorter view is PowerPoint. The grid view in Google Slides, and then you can see all the slides together, so that the students can then work on their individual slides. It does mean if they all have editing rights, it means if someone wants to be a pain, they could go in and delete everything. But I would recommend doing this with a class when you don't have a student that's going to do that. Right. Although, of course, you could then go into the revision history and obviously revert the version of the PowerPoint or the Microsoft Word document, etc., back to a previous version. But that's another thing I think which is really nice. This idea of promoting collaboration as one of the 21st century skills, as one says.
I was doing something similar with that when we were all virtual in our school and we were on Zoom for many months. Is we use Zoom rather than the Google platform. And when students were in breakout rooms and they were working collaboratively, I could see 4 different documents at once and be able to communicate with them, because it was sort of the way I found that you jump into the breakout room with them without having to have the conversation, that you can sort of watch in real time what they're typing and give feedback that way. So that was a good point with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think other tools like Jamboard allows you to do the same thing. So you have up to 20 frames. So you have, you could assign, let's say 2 or 3 students per frame, and that would be fine. I wouldn't recommend having 30 students all working on the same frame. I've tried that in webinars and it doesn't work. Or you could have a tool like whiteboard.fi, which I think is really nice for the students working on their own individual digital mini whiteboard. So you could ask them a question, get them to draw their answer, which can be a great way of promoting speaking. Or you could ask them a question, they could then write their answers, say on a grammar point, and then you can then easily see what each person has done. You could also, a bit like the collaborative PowerPoint idea, you can create a template as an image and then push that image to all the whiteboards, so everyone has the same whiteboard, and then they then draw on their own individual answer. So if you want to have collaboration, but them not on each other's mini whiteboards, then whiteboard.fi is really nice for that. And I'd also give a shout out to to Shalala as well,
Mhm.
which is also similar to whiteboard.fi, although has more features in the sense that you can do collaborative storytelling with drawing, as well as the equivalent of mini whiteboard. So I think that's also another fantastic tool as well for promoting writing, feedback, and collaboration.
I think that when it comes to the interpersonal communication, that technology it seems like a lot of times it's very individualized. So I'm writing, I'm reading. Help us with that interpersonal piece, that interpersonal communication and leveraging technology.
Okay, so when we talk about interpersonal communication, are we talking about because obviously I'm from the UK, I'm not as au fait with the three modes of communication compared to in the state.
So we're talking about real time spontaneous talking.
You could be using Flipgrid as well. You could be using that for conversation in the sense that you could have the camera pointed at two people at the same time and they could be having a conversation with each other. Or you could be using a tool like Quicker Conversations, which allows you to record some audio as a question, and then you send the link to all the students, and then they can all then reply to that in real time. Or you could record your the first line of a dialogue, send the link to a student. They could then reply to that first line with the second line. You could then do the third line, and so on and so forth. That's a completely free tool, by the way. Quicker is spelled QWIQR, and there's two main ways of using it. You can either use it for giving feedback, a little bit like Mote, and you can assign the audio to a QR code, or the conversation option is one when you click on the purple circle with two white speech bubbles on it, and then that allows you um, moderate the conversation as well, which is obviously very good, useful. And you can record your question a bit like Flipgrid, but simpler and quicker, I think, to set up. I love Flipgrid, but I just think if you're looking for just an easy way of practicing conversation, then that could be a real winner. And I think going back to your breakout rooms
Mhm.
idea, I think it's also a nice way of creating, say, 5 quick conversations, sharing the links with the students in individual breakout rooms, and then the people in those breakout rooms can then record, if you like, a summary of what they've been talking about within the breakout room, which I think is also a nice way of being able to promote speaking. And then if you're going to
Mhm.
set up some sort of exchange as well, whereby you're connecting with another school in another country, then you could do a collaborative project again with Flipgrid, but you could also set up. I'm sure there are. Well, I know there are different programs that people use in the States. We had Professor Florencia Henshaw, who was on doing a tilt webinar for
Mhm.
us a few weeks ago, and she talked about a number of different schemes that she uses in her own context. So if you go again to my YouTube channel and dig out her webinar, you'll be able to see the sorts of tools that she recommends for that. But certainly in the UK, we used to have e-twinning, which as a result of Brexit, the B word, we don't have access to now, which is incredibly frustrating. But there are, through Twitter, through social media, we can make these, more informal connections, I suppose, with teachers in other countries, and then create some sort of virtual exchange through those, through all the obvious, Zoom, Google Meet, Teams sessions. But I think it's also very important from a safeguarding point of view that we record all the sessions and that we blur our backgrounds. We try to keep everyone as safe as we possibly can. I think that's also really, really important when we're talking about
Mhm.
interpersonal communication.
How do you refer to that in the UK, that sort of spontaneous speaking?
Well, what we tend to do is we tend to divide the different areas into skills. So we talk about, instead of talking about the three modes of
Mhm.
communication, we talk about listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then also about promoting intercultural understanding as well, which in previous national curriculums we've had, or curricula should I say, that's been sort of one of the key
Mhm.
facets. But we always have the listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It's just in some forms of the whichever the new version at the time of the national curriculum, in some cases would have more focus on one of the skills over other ones. So you might have, for example,
Mhm.
more a percentage, instead of having it as a 25% split, you might have more for, say,
Mhm.
reading or writing, or for speaking. but we generally talk about the 4 skills as opposed to we don't. I mean, we have in the Tilt webinars we've had a number of US speakers who have talked about the modes of communication, but I'm still getting my head around how it all works, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean they're new words for the old concepts. I think they were just they're an attempt to contextualize. I think is really what they're doing,
which is great. Any sort of framework to hang the content onto and to in relation to technology, looking at the different aspects of the different modes of communication is obviously then going to be helpful to say, okay, so for let's say the interpersonal mode, you would use X, Y, and Z in relation to tools, and that makes it more accessible, I think, for teachers in your own context. In the UK context, I think we talk about what are good tools for promoting speaking or listening. I mean, just on that point, I was doing a webinar recently, which I refer to as a clinic, which I've done a few times, which is I give people a week to answer a Google form with lots of questions in it, and then I try to answer the questions myself. But if I can't think of an answer to a question, or I want a bit of help or inspiration, I will ask then the MFL Twitterati to give some suggestions, and they always come up trumps, always brilliant. So I had a question from this group of teachers in the clinic about what are the best free tools for promoting listening skills. So I asked that question to the MFL Twitterati, and then was able to put together a really nice slide full of lots of lovely suggestions, including some free tools and some paid for tools that were also being recommended. So I think having a social media community, being part of a social media community, is just wonderful, not only for professional support, but also I think particularly during the pandemic for sort of personal support, and the fact that you might like the same soccer team as somebody else in the MFL Twitterati, or you might like puns, or you might like whatever it might be, that you can share a joke as well as the serious exchange of pedagogical ideas as well.
We're going to take a break here on this topic. Be sure to check back in next week so you can hear the continuing conversation in part 2 of this conversation with Joe Dale. Be sure to check out the episode blog post for all the links at wlclassroom.com/EP34. Also, be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Joe and get all of the links that he mentioned as well. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.